that tells me a bit about what's going on.
Yeah.
So the benefits there, of course, are that ability to move faster, or at least understand what you're doing. We already understand the key players there, and then you can move forward.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And today I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Damien Lumby, who is the head of process improvement at a leading independent school. Very excited for this conversation. Obviously, we have a diverse range of conversations with people in the process improvement space from all different backgrounds, all different organizations, all different areas. And so this is going to be a very unique perspective that I'm really excited for. Damien, thanks for sitting down with me today.
Thanks, Daniel. Great to be here, and great to see that we're finally out of lockdown here in New South Wales. Today is day one, and I'm still locked down in my house, but it's only because it's raining outside.
That's fantastic. And how did you, talking about process improvement, obviously that's your current role, head of process improvement, but when were you first introduced to this topic of, I guess, a process-centric way of managing an organization? When were you first introduced to this concept or idea? And take us on a bit of a journey leading up to what you're doing today.
Yeah, I could start, I guess, maybe mid-2000s, just leading up to the GFC. And I found myself in a few different businesses, from telcos, through to eventually a Swiss bank, right as the GFC was flipping into its, I guess, the reality there. And that forced this bank to just change the way it did things. Now, we were in the IT side of things, so there were some definite cost savings there. And if we look at the drivers for them, it was really looking at, well, we have to save money fast. And they'd probably not pushed a lot of the process improvements down to the most finite levels, because it didn't matter so much when you're making a lot of money. It more matters. But then when you have to find every cent, you do look at those 1%ers and say, well, this password reset system that was always failing, and therefore costing, I think it was 20% of the calls that came into this IT help desk. And we're talking 80,000 calls a month.
Right.
20% of those were from this one thing that just dropped out because the network, or there was an issue there. So looking at those sorts of things and realizing that actually that was probably an hour's worth of work, or maybe a day's worth of work to fix it, but they put up with it for 10 years.
Right.
But at that point they had to shift. But stepping way, way, way back, I look at this, and it's a plug for my mother, actually. She's a food technology teacher, home economics in the old world. And we grew up cooking. And if you think about the cooking process, if you're doing cakes or biscuits, you tend to follow the process to the letter. If you're doing anything else, you might get creative. And I actually look back to her and my upbringing there, that it was all about process. And the only time you experimented was when you really wanted to sort of go off and try something. And I think my love of process came from her.
Right.
And even now, she's in her 70s, and she's done a whole range of videos in the last year to help her students, still teaching, and put them up on Mrs. Lumby Cooks on YouTube, because she still has that energy for this and wanting people to sort of learn. And I think anybody that went through home ec back in the 90s, 80s might have sort of recognized that, you got the book out, you never went off that sort of letter. So I think I have a lot to thank her for instilling me this love of a form of process.
Yes.
But from a professional standpoint, I guess I was lucky. Maybe many people that you talk to had this, where you didn't expect to do process. You just found yourself at the right place, the right time, or they needed a body to sit there and write something up, and then you found you enjoyed it.
Yes.
And you made a habit of chasing these sort of threads around to work out why things did actually fit together. And that's sort of, I think, how my career has expanded to where I am now.
Yes, that's great. And talking about, you mentioned a driver there, talking about saving money fast, I guess around the time of the GFC. Would you say that is one of the main drivers for an organization to adopt BPM? Do you think there are other key drivers? Does it depend on the industry or depend on the health of the organization? Or what sort of other drivers would you say there are for an organization to adopt this process management approach?
Yeah, you're spot on. I think it comes down to your industry, the time you're in, what needs to happen then and there. So whilst that bank had a particular issue they were trying to sort out, which was spending money and how they could rationalize fast so they could stay in business. Others that I've worked with are looking at compliance elements where they have to do certain things, whether it is working with children checks, better processes for that, or migrating because the NDIS was forcing a not-for-profit to change from being and we talk about not-for-profits really being not for loss, but then when you take the NDIS model, it completely flips their financials, and they had to find efficiencies quickly so that they could actually afford to stay in business. Another one of those there, but also that led to projects looking at how good was the paperwork behind the work, because they had to submit a lot more back to the government. So each one's different. Sometimes it is you get a leader that is just process focused, and I've seen that even recently where you talk to 5 people and there's 5 different ways of doing the same thing, so you realize that the process is like an oral history of what happens, and you need to get it down so that the leadership know what they're dealing with, so then they know, do I need to change, what am I working with? So it does vary, but what I've seen more than anything is cost drivers and compliance drivers.
Yes, right. And I think that's really important, having that clear why when going into a process improvement initiative, is to understand why are we doing what we're doing. I think there have been plenty of organizations that have embarked on this, like a process mapping exercise for say 6, 12, 18 months, depending on the size of the organization, only to get to the end of it. But still left with the questions of like, well, why did we do all that? All of that documentation is sitting somewhere collecting dust. There wasn't a clear why. What was the end goal of that? And so I think there are some organizations out there that have kind of put aside this whole BPM approach because they didn't see value in it the first time they tried it. And so there's this kind of feeling of like, well, our people know what they're doing. Why do we need to adopt this? And so having that clear why is so key.
I think there's an enthusiasm to write process maps and process documentation. And I know there's plenty of software packages out there that can help you. But you're right, if you don't have the why down, then all that's going to happen is you'll have a product that comes in and you may pay for it for a few years, but you'll lose the support for it because it will be seen as something that never quite worked. So where I've been in projects where we've documented every process, but when I talk about that, it's actually every process that's in scope for that piece of work. And if you take bite-sized chunks of work and you document the process there, you're really just saying, well, I'm doing this to frame the piece we're looking at changing. Over time, if you have consistent projects, then you will find that you'll get that view, or at least you'll sort of get your high level, and then you'll start to sort of build it out. So you'll map the universe as you go. But it's also a case where, and keep in mind, my background has largely been contracts, and even in my current role, it's still contract. It's just a longer contract. What happens when I go? I don't know what's happened to that documentation I've done throughout the years. And every now and then you bump into someone who says, oh, I recognize your name because I saw something you wrote 5 years ago, which is lovely. But I don't expect to have a life past, I guess, when I'm there, because usually it's done as a way of getting to the next sort of step. And chances are the process has changed 5 years after I've been there. I sort of hope it has.
Yes.
Some systems make it easier where you can link at the high level and then sort of drill in, and that exec focus I want to know. But I guess the other part we have is if you don't have the ongoing sustainable BPM group within a business after a project, then it's going to be lost anyway, or you'll have 1 or 2 champions that may die out when the leader that was initiating those projects has moved on. So how do you make it more sustainable is probably a challenge.
Yeah,
most of your businesses will have.
Yeah, that's good. I think sustainability is key, and seeing it go long term, even beyond having that beyond that person that initially drove that implementation has moved on. I mean, I have heard stories certainly of the entire organization was mapped, and even without improving anything, significant value was delivered to the organization, just because it provided that transparency of like, hang on a second, now we've documented this all. Why do we have 11 different people throughout the organization doing the same task? There's so much duplicate work here. There's so much waste here. Even just in having that transparency has delivered value, but if that person moves on and then all of a sudden that goes out the window, that's not sustainable,
So you need to have, and not every business will have this luxury, but you do need to have, for that to work, some dedicated roles.
Yes, right.
And a BPM-centric view of the world. When you start a project, you can say, I want to understand all the linkages into this process. And the only way to do that is if you have some central repository. Now, most of us will probably do our best and talk to the various people and get the different guides they've written, or interview to say, tell me about this process, and try to work out what are the 5 people say. And I say 5 people because often, you've got that many sort of different inputs into a process, or at least it gives you a cross-section, 5 different people in different roles. Something I do tend to do is to look at, especially in the processes when I'm getting down to specific areas, let's say if I'm looking at an HR or payroll operation or an area, I'll look at anyone in that area that has a title that's ambiguous. And by ambiguous, I mean coordinator or administrator, because often they're the ones that are holding the process together, because that's where systems aren't linking, or they're saying, well, I'm the one that gets the emails and moves it from this folder to the next folder.
Right.
And they'll usually know how all the different inputs and outputs, at least at that lower level. They're not necessarily strategically setting goals. They're just making it happen. So if you talk to that sort of person, or even look at an org chart and say, how many people have the title admin or administrator? The more administrators, probably the less efficient your process is going to be, because you have those stop points along the way.
Right.
And I guess a way around that is have more meaningful titles. But
yes,
then again,
right.
Sometimes it is it's the bucket that everything falls into. You'll find that person that kind of does everything.
Yeah.
Know them really, really well, because then you'll find out sort of more of the truths behind how the business operates.
Right. That's great. And on the topic of transparency, process documentation, providing that transparency, what are the challenges with that? Because obviously what that transparency shows is like poor performance, waste in the process. But there are people attached to each of these areas, and people that, if it's not communicated in the right way, you've got that challenge of bringing these people along for the journey, so that they don't have that sort of feel that being personally attacked, and that therefore putting up maybe roadblocks or hurdles that could be avoided if it was done a different way. So what are the challenges that come along with this transparency? How do you navigate that when, at the end of the day, you are working with people?
I will often talk about why I'm here, clarify any misconception. It's nice to have a job description that's very clear, because I can actually say, look, this is my role. My role is to look for efficiencies. It is to link processes together. You mentioned the different wastes. I do like the 8 wastes model, and talking through this to understand, when we write processes, it might be that I will focus a little bit on the non-utilization of talent, because then you're talking to the people. What did you train? Is it somebody that spent 4 years doing a business degree, and now they're doing is moving an email from this folder to the next folder, and they've had ideas how to fix it, but nobody will listen because they're junior.
Right.
I'll try to make it personal. It's very hard if somebody's feeling threatened anyway, or feels that their skill set is limited. And some roles where maybe the role doesn't require tertiary education, extra skills, they are easily replaced. It's hard. It's always going to be hard. because maybe they should be replaced by some form of automation. And you can't necessarily get around it because those fillers are roles you are trying to eradicate. But what you can do is look for, well, are there other opportunities? Can HR help work on redeployments or even upskilling? Looking at the processes and trying to map capabilities and skills required to them can be quite confronting. And I'll talk about general skills versus specific skills, because you have general skills of a modern workforce is that, they can use a computer, they have access to mobile devices, they can log into your main sort of corporate systems. I wouldn't say that using Microsoft Word these days is a skill that any employee shouldn't have, or the equivalent, right? Down to, let's say an accountant has a very specific skill set and a compliance-based skill set as well. So it can be hard. And at times I've forgotten the emotional side when I go in, and I have to remember that every conversation I have is going to impact others differently. Some people are fine with it. Some people say they're fine. And then you see a few months later that actually they're not fine, but they felt they had to say they were fine. And as somebody that's been made redundant a few times, the first time was confronting, the second time was joyful, just the right time to get a payout, but I was also age considerate as well. That was in my 30s, and it's not like I couldn't just find another job. But when you're dealing with people that are much older, maybe not quite ready for retirement, maybe have other challenges where they need to keep working, it's good to know these parts. So getting to know the people you're working with when it's possible. On the bigger projects, when you're sort of further up, it is actually hard to know those people personally. Really, really hard. And so, I think one of the benefits of some of the industries like banking that have gone through a lot of change in the last 20 years is this cycle of change is just part of business. 2 to 3 years is a long time to be in some of those businesses or roles. Right. So they're okay. But when you get to businesses that haven't changed and you really are dealing with the person that has kept the process going for 20 years, emotions can sometimes get to you. But then just focus on what you're there to do. And as long as the leadership, and I find they think they have sometimes, but they haven't necessarily done it. When I walk in, it's obviously when the leadership has already made decisions to go. So there's funding for a role like mine to come in, or a project team if we're coming in as a project. And leadership have sometimes thought they've communicated well about what's about to happen because they've sent an email or done a town hall, but it hasn't filtered necessarily down. So good leaders will also make sure that their own leadership team down through the levels are well informed. Doesn't always happen, and leaders vary. So I think having a little bit more heart and empathy and remembering you're dealing with people, even if the end result for them may not be great, at least they didn't feel like you were a robot coming in to coldly take their information. It's not always.
Yeah, that's good. And I guess the question that probably excites me the most, and I would say some of our audience or most of our audience is, what's possible with BPM? Because as we talked about it towards the start of the conversation, there have been plenty of organizations that have this, I guess, tainted perception of what the value that BPM can bring to an organization. Obviously, many organizations are investing into this area. So there is perceived value there, and some organizations are realizing that value significantly. Do you have sort of examples or case studies or stories, and obviously censor the information that you can't share, but of where an organization has adopted this process-centric approach in whatever form that looks like, and it has delivered significant value to that organization?
Yeah, that clarity on what happens next is important. Bringing teams closer together. There was one, it was a big educational institution that I was running a project on, and teams were so segregated. Larger business, more segregation. You don't know the person in the next building. You may never see them. Smaller business, it's much easier. You may still not want to talk to them, but you might see them every day. So actually getting teams together that didn't talk and helping them review a process together or a link set of processes before trying to improve it. There were these conversations saying, "Oh, I didn't realize you had to do these 10 steps after my part," and it might be that somebody was holding up a process by up to a year because they themselves were overwhelmed from a number of different data issues that were coming through and under-resourced and data issues, but they just didn't know. Like, they knew their process went on to another team, but they didn't know what the impact was and what the impact of missing dates considerably was, whether it be trying to get funding from different organizations, and the impact of missing key dates by 2 months meant that, don't just miss out on funding, but you've got to completely reapply for funding you may have already received because everything was compounding. So that's the biggest benefit is actually having teams realize their part in the puzzle on the human level, but also if you're going in to provide change, being able to almost say, well, this is the part we're going to change. Let's actually understand what we're about to change. Like a survey a dial before you dig, as they do out here. And, you don't want to cut through the phone lines. That's a very expensive mistake, but it's the same with process. If you have something to review, to start with, you can look there and as a group say, right, this is what it was last time we documented it. Is it still the same?
Right.
So that is, to me, the biggest benefit is that clarity of what you're going through. And we can all find it in different ways. It may not be as formal as beautifully curated process maps or documents, but usually the good operators within your business will write down what they do in some form of guide.
Right.
And those people are the ones that we should really be celebrating. Somebody that had the thought to write down a process that wasn't written down, even if it's dodgy screenshots pasted into a Word doc. At least they tried.
Yes.
And we should be grateful for that, because if it's not there, we have to start from scratch. And so we can get those and we'll save them to a drive. And even if it's bad, we just say, right, that tells me a bit about what's going on.
Yep.
So the benefits there, of course, are that ability to move faster, or at least understand what you're doing. We already understand the key players there, and then you can move forward. I do think it's a challenge in some of the smaller businesses to bring in software programs that might actually be really, really beneficial. Because you can't just bring in a software program, you have to have a role that supports it. You have to have a standard you're sort of working to, and that's quite a considerable investment up front, and long-term justification might be there. Short-term, it's hard to, and especially moments like now where a lot of businesses are stressed from a few years of economic strain. And so that's why little bit by little bit is, good trying to find and even advertise the value of this by showing how easy it is, maybe to the execs.
Yes.
How easy it is for you to see what happens on the ground.
Yes, right. I like what you're saying there about finding those people or those leaders that are naturally documenting down what they do, because it does remind me of other conversations I've had where the advice given has been to find your champions, find your process champions, and they may not necessarily be people with the process design lead title, but those people that naturally, whatever role they're in, naturally think through a process sort of centric approach, whether they know the language or not. The people that are naturally understanding that, hey, if I'm doing this sequence of tasks and activities, they may not have this exact thought, but what if I get hit by a bus tomorrow? Who's going to take on that responsibility and continue to drive that area of the business at the same sort of efficiency, or the same following the same sort of sequence of tasks and activities that I have been driving this area of the business? Am I bottlenecking this area, or am I actually providing that documentation or that ability for the business to continue to thrive, whether I'm in this role or not? I guess ultimately not feeling threatened about, whether you're in the role or not. But finding those champions.
That the closer somebody is to retirement age, the more they're starting to write things down, especially if they've been in a business that doesn't have high turnover. And there have been plenty that I've been in there, and the process hasn't changed, not because people haven't wanted to, but because it just hasn't changed. Maybe the system they're in was cheap enough, and whilst it was clunky, it was okay. It was cheap enough for the business to want to move all that. the cost of change was quite heavy, so they just kind of made do. But then you get to the point where the workforce is starting to think about retirement, and they just document naturally. But I also find that it takes a lot of time to document processes, and that's another challenge that the business is going to have, just to stop and do it and recognize that that doesn't take an hour to write a process map. You've got quite a few drafts, and every time you send it back, somebody thinks something more. So recording conversations like this kind of stuff here, and actually doing in sort of an oral history of what happened, is actually handy.
Right.
And instead of writing down a process map, you could record 2-minute snapshots of what I'm doing. Whilst I'm doing it, I'm just going to click on record, self-record your own Zoom, or if you've got different tools on your systems, like Microsoft Stream is a standard inbuilt one. I think Macs have them as well, and just actually record little movies saying, I'm just going to run through the payments process right now.
Right.
And that might be, I'm actually running a payment process, so therefore I'm just recording what I'm doing live. I'm not having to then take screenshots and dump them into a document, write them up. And then you can save that link on a drive saying, oh, this is step 1 in the process, step 2, step 3. Yep. And that's actually quite achievable once people know how to use the technology, if they know how to. And it allows somebody like me to come in and say, oh, I can watch the process rather than read the process, or even listen while I'm doing something else.
Yes.
Really, we should make it as easy as possible, but there are so many different ways that people could perceive that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that I think you mentioned it earlier, like bringing multiple stakeholders into the one room to sort of have these conversations around, well, what's actually going on. You could have, you may end up with different sort of opinions or perspectives on what's actually happening. And you were talking before about, what's the upstream impact, what's the downstream impact? Are we taking this into consideration? And I think that, with technology, newer technology, it's not so new now, but like technologies like process mining or things like that, where it can look at the existing data within your systems and really determine or discover or what's actually going on based on the data that's in our systems. And I think, that sort of opens up a whole nother can of worms. One of the challenges with process mining is having usable data there to be able to gain those insights and things like that. But I had another question about, and I think it's a challenge for a lot of organizations that some of them may not even be aware of, but so focused on simplifying their own internal processes, and how simple can we make it for us as a business without necessarily factoring in, well, how simple are we making it for the customer? Because sometimes making it simple for the business actually makes it a lot more complex and complicated for the customer.
Fixing it for one person and 700 others are impacted poorly doesn't really help the business. So having those persona views on the process is actually important, and interviewing customers where you can. It depends on what your customers are and your transaction with them as to how much you can get out of it. But spending a little bit of time talking to them, for independent schools, your customers are not just the students, and they're quite important, but also you've got your teachers, your parents, because for an independent school, they're the ones that are paying to keep them up. And realizing that, maybe you're sending them 10 different communication methods. You've got to get them to log into 4 different systems because something doesn't work. And it's the same with, I guess, a coffee shop that's looking at their process. What do their customers think of them? Well, maybe on certain days the barista's too slow and you don't get your coffee, so you go one down the road because you see a certain barista, but you don't want to say it because you don't want to hurt their feelings. How can you get that feedback? And I'm sure plenty of coffee shop owners have wondered why their businesses have turned and they've never been able to work it out.
Yes.
It must be that there's a better coffee in general, but for the customer side of things, you need to know what they think, but at the same time, your customers are going to change. So you kind of need to almost predict what the customers will want next. And so therefore, we at the school, we do actually spend a lot of time talking to our peers to find out what are you hearing in the market. And it's interesting, as an industry, it's different to the corporate world in that respect, where there is a lot of communication across the schools.
Right.
really, really nice. There's a lot of heart here, which is what you expect. There's challenges because schools don't have the resource or budgets of big corporates. But the difference is that people have been there longer. There is heart. People do talk. People know everyone. And so, you can really see what's happening. But what it's probably lacking is that outward view on what does a school look like in 10 years.
Right.
And I guess, universities are going through this now. Rapid shift to online learning has changed their business model dramatically, probably opened up a heck of a lot of competition as well that comes off the back of that. And where businesses like banks for the last 20 years have really embraced that customer-focused technology from the apps and the net banks and the like.
Yeah,
it's different in different marketplaces. Like, what does that look like now, and how does the customer change? What do parents want in 20 years? We don't know, because those parents are probably 20 years old right now. And
that's right.
They want from their kids and the like. So it's a hard one, but if you can get that data, and I know you can pay for different data sets to tell you, so there's some of the trends. But if you can get that data out of your systems, even to see what's happening now, and maybe how has your demographic changed in the last 5 years, and marry that up with some ABS data and some predictive data there, then that'd be quite helpful from a process side, watching the market. But again, it comes down to, do you have the resource to invest heavily into some of these things? Because you can do a lot of casual reading, but then sort of saying, well, I need to prepare for what's happening in 5 years. If you've got one person doing a lot of stuff, it's hard. And some industries are investing heavily into this because they want to be ahead of the curve. They want to be the ones releasing the next. We talk about the iPhone, and so I'll talk about my Apple Watch probably more there, or with the Google Home we've just brought in here 5 years ago. I wouldn't have even thought about this, whereas others were ahead of the curve on that kind of stuff. I think, how can you get your data around your process to actually be predicting where things are going to be a problem?
Yes.
And the formality of the data set you have in your systems really does vary business to business, and even simple things like getting the data out in a format that is able to be properly analyzed. What are the certain markers, and so I do like bringing in systems to enhance processes, not just process mapping systems, but if we've got pieces of paper, we come back to the wastes model. We're moving a lot of things around, but also it's hard to track data. You can bring OCR and the like in for PDFs, but there's nothing better than actually removing the paper entirely. But that takes considerable investment to bring in the right systems, even getting to the point of saying what is the right system to bring in. But at least if it's in a data form, and if you've chosen well with modern systems that have good connectors, then you can get your data out and start to move through it. But so we'll probably see far more investment. You already see it in most industries, but especially where I am now in a college, you'll see far more investment in that data analysis side. What is actually happening here, which hasn't necessarily been something that independent schools have done, or schools in general. Universities have been great, but they're so commercially driven. It's far. I don't want to say they're not running on a heart sort of format, but it is quite different to the schools, because you're literally bringing children through. Their universities is a commercial. This is how much you're going to cost. This is how much we can make. But I think they're far, far further ahead of this because they have to be.
Right. Okay.
Banks, of course, they will be, because they're highly competitive. And your manufacturing will look at their processes differently, because one single failure could actually mean a day of downtime. Or I worked in one business where they were looking at pallets into warehousing, and timber pallets, one bump from a crane or something could actually move that pallet to a point where it couldn't be automatically placed in a warehouse, because more tolerances now compared to pallets that literally hadn't really changed since the 1940s. And so they had to be, because of automated warehousing. It's very, very different the way your process and your data is going to run to this. But every business could look at their processes and improve somewhere. You should. It's just how do you do it, And if we look at those data or those process capture systems, how can they sort of scale down to make it easy for the small business to the large business, where data might not necessarily be available and resource might not necessarily be available? How easy can you make it so that you can capture, all those different businesses, even if they don't have time to capture or know what they're doing? I still haven't worked it out. But I'll keep trying.
Yeah, no, that's good. I like the example you were giving earlier about the cafe, and you probably won't hear from your customer like, hey, I'm going to a different cafe now. They'll just make that decision, and I think we can see it in a lot of different areas. Like if we look at our own personal lives, as a consumer, as a customer of many organizations out there, I know that I have switched big banks, and where I'm choosing to invest my money. I've also more recently changed which internet provider I go with. Did I have a conversation with my previous internet provider? No, I had probably a series of 10 phone calls with support that kind of left me frustrated, and hence why I moved on. But I think if we look at our own lives and the organizations that we are interacting with, we can see how quickly and how easy it is today, especially, and how easy organizations make it to make that switch. I mean, I also changed electricity providers only a month or two ago, and literally it was a 5-minute conversation, and they did all the moving for us. So it's not difficult at all these days to jump ship and to make that move. So as organizations, we need to understand, well, where are those risks? Where are we vulnerable to our customers, deciding one day, I'm going to look elsewhere.
Yeah, it'd be interesting in a few years to look at that switch and say, did they put the same effort into improving the processes to retain you as they did to get you across? And there's high switching costs, or perceived high switching costs, for bigger change on process. But if you take it down to what you've just done there, it was probably you didn't change earlier because it was just painful. You thought it'd be painful until you realized it wasn't a painful process to switch over. I guess it's the same with business processes. Until you really know what you're dealing with, or somebody makes it really easy to see that change isn't that hard, then you'll stick with what you've got. And that's what I find quite a lot when I go into organizations, is they've put up with a crappy system for 20 years because they didn't realize that better ones came out 10 years ago because nobody had seen them, because they'd been sort of a closed shop. Whereas businesses where there's high change, high turnover, which over the generations it changes. What is a long term of employment? I think it's 2 years now, maybe is a long term, especially as you're moving up. As you get older, you sort of probably plateau a bit because that moving around gives you the experience and exposure. But then again, those businesses that have high turnover, the bigger corporates, those that see more may not actually have a voice to help improve it. So they may also have crappy systems because the longer term, older people, as I'm getting older, may not want to change because they've had bad experiences. But I do think that the rapid development of cloud-based systems, and now in particular ecosystem-based approach systems that have good data connectors, will enable us to change faster. It'll also probably constrain our process approach. We will take the process they offer because it is what they offer. We will do far less system customization per business outside of your larger businesses that can spend $100 million on an implementation because they have that and it makes sense. But smaller to medium-sized businesses will accept the process that a system provides. And that's great, this plug and play view, because then we as process people can focus on everything that can't fit into those boxes and then just keep on refining and keep pushing, which will lead to more innovation in the market. As long as these providers, whether they be startups we don't know about yet or incumbents that are looking to develop, as long as there is money to be made, a competitive marketplace out there, they will want to cover those gaps because you have to stay relevant. You have to evolve to meet your customer needs. Otherwise, somebody else will. Mm-hmm. And I think our part in this, and maybe not everybody in these roles gets the opportunity. I'm lucky that I've worked for both software vendors and customers. I think the process roles really should be, where possible, mated up to the vendor management roles. The process should fit under everything as well, but and the bigger the business, the more segregated they'll probably be. But the closer you can be to your software vendor relationships, firstly, the more you're going to understand about them, those vendors and what they can provide, but also the more you can influence where they're going.
Right.
we have in my current college, we've got a product. It's called Clipboard, a clipboard app, and it's used for co-curricular management, sports, co-curricular band, that kind of stuff. And it's great. A couple of guys that started it were basketball coaches at Knox Grammar in Sydney.
All right. Okay.
They saw a need, so they went out and filled the need. They great system. They've done a really, really good job fundraising and development. And their product approach is great. Ed, who I deal with there, I went to him about a year ago and said, right, we've got a rugby program where your product we've brought in to manage it. It didn't quite fit. Now, we could have just gone and said, stuff it, we'll move away from this. But I worked with the various conveners, one of them being a Wallabies World Cup winning player that actually was in our rugby program, and said, what's the problem? They were able to tell me what the problem was. So we wrote up stories. So this is where my role is more than just process. It's actually facilitating improvement. And so I look at process, project management, a bit of BA work, and definitely change management. But I throw in there the vendor management part, because this is a small vendor who really loves their marketplace. And so I've been able to work with them. And over the last year, they've brought through the improvements that now make their product, not just for us, but for everybody that uses it, much better. This flexibility to be able to manage teams and also just manage changes between large numbers of teams was really important to us. Now, if we hadn't have done that, by now we probably would have said, that's it, we can't use Clipboard. But instead, my preference was to work with the vendor and say, we like your product. These are the challenges we have. Can you help us overcome them?
Right.
And they've gone, good. And then they've validated that with other schools, because they can't just meet our needs, because it might meet the needs of another school. But once they went through, they came back, and I like the fact that Ed came back and said, we can do this, but the rest of it doesn't actually fit our model. It's not what we're interested in doing. It is actually moving away from our profitable core. And he was really, really clear about that, and then proceeded to develop really, really well. And because of that, we have a much better product. We haven't had to go through the switching again. They've got a much better product. They've got another loyal customer who, as I'm doing now, will talk about them positively. I think there is a great relationship there. And again, maybe not so much in the big business to big system provider, because it's a different relationship. But when you get down to that sort of mid-level, down to small to medium businesses, you can have more dialogue, but not everybody thinks they can. They'll switch rather than talk to their providers and say, can you help us? What can you do?
Yes.
And that's, they've now helped us improve the process. We've helped them improve their process. And we've started a little bit more communication, a bit more of a network that can sort of then start talking and saying, what does this school think? How do we go with that? I prefer that, because that means that the investment we can make the most of it. And it does support a really important part of our overall process model there for compliance. Again, that's a big driver of compliance, where this helps us mark, did somebody turn up for training? Did they turn up for the game? What happens if they don't? But very focused on sport.
Yeah. That's great. And you said something earlier about as a high school, not having as much pressure to adapt and change, say, as a university, with more of that sort of commercial lens, and being forced to maybe look at their processes. And how important is it, or what value is available to organizations looking at how, I guess high school, university in the same sort of sector, education sort of field, what value is there for an organization to look at totally different industries? Because I think, and where this question comes from is knowing that over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a huge amount of startup companies that have entered spaces completely disrupting entire industries, like the financial services space, or transportation, or the hospitality space, like whatever area it is. And generally, not all the time, but I would say oftentimes these sort of really radical, innovative ideas and ways of delivering value in a way that it's never been done before has come from people that are entering an industry that they're actually not from. So they're not, that they haven't been in that industry for 20, 30, 40 years. So this is the way that it's always has been done and always will be done. But they're coming from an outside perspective to be like, actually, we can deliver that same sort of taxi service in a totally different and better, more efficient way for the customer, or we can deliver a totally different accommodation providing service than it ever has been done before. How important is it for, I guess from your perspective at the moment, it's from that sort of school lens. But I mean, you could probably talk to it from any organization looking at different industries and being like, well, they've been disrupted and they've had to adapt and pivot. What can we glean from the journey they've just been on?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to the industry's ability to shift focus or accept new things. And I think there's a lot of different roles are more interested in this. Some people don't like change, so they don't want to embrace anything. And I remember when Uber first came in, and I was working for a business then, and we used cab charge, and it was woeful. And sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes you had to use your own credit card, and there's a few of us that end up with some scanned credit cards that end up causing a problem. We you could always pinpoint, we knew exactly when it happens because of these darn cab charges. And then we were allowed to shift to Uber, and it was brilliant. And then as Uber developed, and I'm not saying Uber necessarily is the best provider, it's just an example, but it was they improved their product to be more business relevant, I think, once they saw the market. So education at the moment. So I think that we'll see a lot more of that innovation, and that product board that I mentioned there is just one of a few younger providers that are coming through who've seen that opportunity and don't necessarily want to be the be all and end all, every one system for everything. They know that an ecosystem approach is a really sensible way to go. You are really good at what you do and work really well with other vendors. I think that's great. And we see that sort of stretching now into the NDIS opened up this, for those outside of Australia, that's the National Disability Insurance Scheme that is changing the way we're funding support and care for people with disability. But that actually encouraged the market to open up. But it took a few years, because you can't just suddenly come up with an idea and start it overnight. You could have been people, and I've seen this with a few, that were working within organizations that saw an opportunity and their business wasn't that interested. The struggle that they had was finding funding for this. But we also know that New South Wales in particular has quite a few startup hubs and a real focus on investment into not just fintech, but all sorts of tech startups, because that is creating a movement here that says, the small business to medium business market is there. But I think the challenge is, I'm lucky, I've got an MBA. That's 5 years part-time hard work. I think my wife is still not quite forgiven me for that. But that was an investment that I put in so that I could differentiate myself and really just think about things differently. Not everybody has that. They don't necessarily have this opportunity, but you can encourage people with good ideas to certainly start documenting them and seeing what opportunities are there, because every process we look at probably has some sort of commercial opportunity behind it. It's seeing whether it really is sort of a cottage industry process where it's not much in there, or if it's something bigger. The challenge is always going to be that schools, not-for-profits, big businesses, the execs or those that make the decisions around process will often like what they've got because it's safe, it works. You might need to wait for the opportunity to shift to a better product when a new leader comes in that's willing to try stuff, or they may have seen something else as well. But it's worth keeping an eye on the market and finding out what's out there, or even promoting. There's various forums, and we use them in colleges, but different businesses will have them, from bookkeepers through to HR people. There's all their forums actually posting, saying, this is a challenge I've got, and starting some sort of dialogue about the challenges you have, because generally vendors or people that have an idea will be focused on those as well to find out, where is my next opportunity here? What should I be going through? And the smaller the vendor, the easier it seems for them to change their product to suit that. So keep talking, I guess, keep promoting what the issues are you need to go through, and don't just accept that the system you've got today is going to be the system that you'll have in 2 or 3 years' time. Look at it as most system relationships 2 to 3 years, and your contracts will run that long if they're not a month to month, because it usually takes you the first year just to get it running, then you've got a year of sort of buying, and then by the third year, like, well, we're too hard to change in our part, but maybe you also bite your systems down to smaller amounts that are much easier to flip if you find a better product or need to go. You're not having to sort of tip over the entire ship to refill its contents. You're just actually emptying one compartment that isn't working.
Yeah. Now, there are many, obviously many organizations that still are working to put the foundational elements in place when it comes to a process-centric approach, having process ownership, process governance, having this a BPM mindset, and having a continuous improvement culture in the organization. So there, every organization is at a different starting point if we're talking about today. But if you look to the next 2, 3, 5 years, I guess aside from getting people up to a point where they should be already today, what sort of trends are you noticing? Where is BPM heading in the future? Obviously, technology is going to be more and more of a thing, but I guess what do you see over the next 2, 3, 5 years, and where would you be encouraging organizations to be investing their time, effort, energy, and resources when it comes to this process-centric approach?
I would invest it in data and clarity around data. If you can't pull your data out, it's very hard to quantify your processes, even in smaller business. So if you're looking at systems, and I tell you about systems because often businesses will switch to, I need a finance system or an HR system or a CRM. Just make sure you have your data design and your data outputs really clear, or the ability to get data out. Now, I think that Power BI has picked up and is far more accessible than it used to be. You've got all sorts of, just give me a second, Daniel, my robot vacuum, my process improvement for maintaining my house has just started. It's going to be noisy. I do love things like that, by the way. It's, how do I stop it? Now, here we go. This is where I really embarrass myself. There we go. Just pause it. A great improvement in my own housekeeping process right there is a robot vacuum. As long as you've picked up all the Lego and the Barbies, bead necklaces that my kids leave around, the robot vacuum doesn't quite like them so much. But data, I think it comes back to, can you access your data? Is your data telling you what you need to know? What are the markets you're most interested in? Is it volume? Is it the cost per transaction you're running through? Bigger business around, say, manufacturing, pharmaceutical, and banking, they're really good at this because they have to be, and they've set almost the high-level processes around this. You look at any of those, like, Toyota's a famous one for this. But because of the way that systems are developed over the last decade, especially cloud-based systems, and if they've taken an API-first approach or a data-first approach, you can usually find better systems to provide your data outputs. The process that you're running through your business process is one thing, but if you can't actually get anything out of the back that tells you what you're doing, it's kind of hard. And I do like to, where possible, take a process and even to say, well, for each of these steps, what's the volume, what's the time taken, what's the lag time? Do I have to wait 2 weeks before I can go on to the next one because of who knows? And so, but at least if you've got data, you can start plugging it against it and sort of working out, well, where's your heat? Where do you need to sort of focus your time? And I think you'll find that we've already seen anyway your different database roles. If you look into HUDs and salary guides, they're actually going up quite a lot because at the moment there's high demand. What is happening in my business? And we'll have to turn to the data to tell me. And hopefully you can marry that up to the process so you have a complete picture of, what do we do, who does it, and how many times are we doing it, for what cost, how long.
That's great. Well, Damien, thanks so much for sitting down with me today. I've certainly been taking a lot of notes and gleaning a lot from this conversation. And I know that our audience will have learned a lot and gleaned a lot from you as well. So I just want to thank you for sitting down and having this chat with me today.
Thanks, Daniel. Absolute pleasure. And keep doing this. Great work.